Fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. On behalf of the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron and our special guest this evening, I want to thank you for joining us. This program was recorded live on February 9th, 2012. I'm your moderator, Stan Ross, and we're beginning to see some questions coming in on the chat line, and we really appreciate those, so please keep them coming. We have once again overcome the incredible technical challenges, and on the line joining us are Colonel Charles McGee and Colonel Harold Brown, Tuskegee Airmen, and we're going to be discussing the Red Tails film and their experiences in World War II and beyond as Tuskegee Airmen. So a couple of housekeeping notes as we begin tonight. Let's simplify things by asking if Colonel McGee, if you could be the first to answer the questions that are posed and hand it off to Colonel Brown. Does that sound reasonable?
It does.
Fantastic. So the first question I have is from Bill Zook. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Correct me online if you'd like. How much involvement did members of the Tuskegee Airmen have with George, Lucas, or others in Red Tail's production team? This comes from Winnipeg.
Yeah, there were advisors, if you will, or like a little technical team that he had to be sure that they understood the actual aviation fact. That is, the producer and the writers understood, could ask us questions. There was a team earlier. Lucas turned down some scripts, went to the Star Wars sequel, came back to it, and another advisory team participated, and you have the Red Tails movie.
Fantastic. That was from Bill Zook in Winnipeg. And Maria Tenuto asks, did you view the film Red Tails at the White House? From Mary Jo Tenuto.
Yes, I was present in the group that was invited to the White House. It was pleasant to share with President Obama and his wife, Michelle.
Wow. And Colonel Brown, did you have the privilege of joining Charles at the White House for that event?
No, I did not have that privilege.
Okay, well, sorry about that. That sounds like it was quite an exciting event. Is that your first trip to the White House, Colonel McGee?
No, I'd been there a couple of times, different parts of it, but it was a very pleasant evening, and it's quite a structure, so it's nice to be in, I guess we would say, head shed.
About that. Pretty amazing. Gina Marie Bowler asks, was there really a romance in your experience in World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen?
I would imagine there was, whether I'm not aware of one as depicted in the movie, but that's what the script writers came up with. But during those war years, I'm not aware of a romance to the degree that's depicted in the movie. But I'm sure there were some folks that during the R&R rest and recuperation periods had company.
Fantastic. Colonel Brown, did you observe any romantic encounters with the local citizens in your experience?
No, not really. I would pretty much echo what Chuck said. If it did happen, it would probably have been while they were on rest and recuperation down in Naples. But nothing quite like what was portrayed in the Red Tails. I'm not aware of anything that went quite that far.
Wonderful. And then the question again from Winnipeg is, how did the Italians treat you?
The Italians treated us as American citizens, and that's one thing I think all of us could say going, they didn't look at us as black Americans. We were just people, and they treated us, in my contact and so on, very pleasantly, and that's one of the good things I've found of being in overseas areas.
Just refresh the commentary from our previous webinars. Rodney Hall asks, "What is your opinion of the film in short order?"
Well, I think the writers gave Lucas a good script that gets over many of the points that the experience brought out, and certainly everyone agree, and whether everything individuals all acted as depicted in the movie, that's certainly probably not the case, but I think he puts the story together well. If folks look at the value lessons in it that are brought out, they should enjoy the film.
Wonderful. And any follow-on to that, Colonel Brown?
No, I would say that's pretty much the case. For example, when they went down and they wiped out that destroyer. Now, that was based upon facts. We did have 2 pilots attack the destroyer, and don't ask me how in the world they ever did it, either by ricochet or whatever, but the bullets hit the magazine packed within the destroyer, and the whole thing came out of the water. So that was actually a factual thing. Matter of fact, I think we're the only Air Force group that is credited with destroying a destroyer. I think that's the case, isn't it, Chuck?
Yeah, it really wasn't. It was a converted a vessel, a destroyer type, I would say, rather than actually being a destroyer. And yes, the pilots had some well-bore-sighted P-47. Those 8 guns did a job.
Fantastic.
Stan,
here's another question from Dennis Fight, and I would like to know the answer to this as well. Who were the gruesome twosome? Do either of you have comments on or knowledge of that?
You had a couple that were called the gruesome twosome, and as I say, whether their experiences are fully as depicted in the movie, I wouldn't agree there all the way, but we did have a couple that fit that bill, and that terminology was used.
Wasn't that Pruitt and Lee Archer?
Lee Archer and Wendell Pruitt, you got it.
Yeah, how about that? Very, very fun. Colonel McGee, Walter Gerald wants to know, how many wars and military conflicts did you participate in as a fighter pilot?
Well, I enjoyed my flying, stayed in. When I wanted to get in airlines, they weren't ready, so I stayed in the military and had great assignments. Participated in the early days of the Korean War because they grabbed P-51 pilots right quick to get started. We actually flew our first missions out of Japan while they built the first strip inside Pusan perimeter. And then when they needed additional tactical intelligence gathering, a couple of new squadrons were formed, and I ended up taking a squadron to Vietnam near Tan Son Nhut Air Base. So, that gave me an Air Force record of fighter combat at World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. That is Air Force. I think there's some pilots around that have flown more missions, but not all fighter either.
Interesting. A follow-on question for both Colonel McGee and Colonel Brown. Do you have children and grandchildren, and do any of them pursue military careers?
Well, my son was in the service for a while, but wanted to stay in high performance, and they wanted to do something else, so he got out and ended up in the airline. And other than that, right now, he has a daughter, my granddaughter, who is a first-year cadet at the Air Force Academy.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Colonel McGee's son at the gathering of Mustangs, and as I recall, Colonel McGee, you reflected that you started your career in the Mustang and ended it with the F-4 Phantom, and your son, I believe, started his military flying career with the F-4 and has hopes of finishing in a P-51 Mustang. Any comments on that?
Well, that's certainly true. It was quite a coincidence to realize that I was flying F-4s in Vietnam. He was flying F-4s out of Thailand. And that was our contact, closest, if you will, being in the same aircraft. He'd like to get into the 51, whether that would be a possibility, and he flies a Red Tail one day, I don't know, but it's certainly something to get qualified in whether he can do that. But we did share those experiences that way.
It was a really great event to see both of you attending, and it was a real honor. And again, I can reflect a lot of the questions that are coming on the question board right now, issuing great appreciation for your service and your family's service to the military effort that we need to continue.
We thank everyone for those expressions, certainly.
Are either of you going to, planning to attend the EAA Air Venture this summer for the Salute to the Tuskegee Airmen? Scott Miller would like to know that. I'm sure the rest of us would be curious to see if we'll be able to meet you there.
Well, my answer has always been, good Lord willing, the creek doesn't rise, I'd hope to be there. I don't know.
Colonel Brown, can you join us at
Hopefully I'll be there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We'll all look forward to seeing you. So that's another great opportunity to see these particular Tuskegee Airmen and others. Particularly the Chicago contingent has a great group of people that come to that. Here in Minnesota, there are a couple of events coming up in February where people can meet Major Joseph Gomer on February 25th at the Galaxy Library in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and I believe on the 29th at the Minnesota Historical Society. Dr. Gomer is going to join in for some retelling of some great stories. There are a lot of events coming up that people can take a peek at on redtail.org. We invite you to visit there either during this broadcast or in your spare time before, during, and after, of course. Take a look at the events calendar. A tremendous number of fun events already scheduled all over the country. February 29th in Columbus, Mississippi. March 6th at the Tulsa Air and Space Museum. Also in March, Lakeland, Florida school visits in Lakeland, Florida and the surrounding areas. Sun and Fun in Lakeland, and on into April with the World War II Heritage Days in Peachtree City, Georgia, and all over the country. So by all means, make an effort to get out and meet these folks. They're tremendous people, and you'll really enjoy meeting them in person even more than you, I'm sure, are enjoying this conversation with them. Do you guys have plans, Colonel McGee and Colonel Brown, do you have plans for specific events in your neighborhoods that you would like to mention?
Well, there's, as you already mentioned, that we shared in seeing the Red Tails with the President. There have been other venues where they're particularly trying to get groups of young folks into a theater environment, get a chance to see it. So, as you say, I think folks just need to be aware in their area of what's going on and make the effort to, I'd say, get young folks to see it and answer their questions, because the lessons in it are still good for the youngsters who are our future.
And Colonel Brown, anything coming up that you'd like us to make sure to put on our calendars?
No, I don't know of anything that's going on up here other than the normal Cleveland Air Show, which comes in when around sometime in September. But it's interesting, right here at the local airport at the Ottawa Airport. There's a bunch of old former Air Force and guys, and they are restoring the old 1929 Ford tri-motor, the Tin Goose. You know, the Tin Goose spent a good deal of his time flying up in northern Ohio, between here and over in the islands, Put-in Bay, South Bass, Middle Bass. So that airplane is well recognized up here. But they are restoring one that's coming right along. I still, as I look at it, it appears to me that they are still a good 3-4 years away from it. But at least they're steadily making progress on it. And at the rate they're going, they'll eventually get there. It's just going to take a little time. But that's about the only thing I know that's going on up here.
And that is the nature of aircraft restoration. We witnessed it at the Minnesota wing of the Commemorative Air Force with over 10,000 hours of time put into restoring our B-25. And speaking of B-25s, we're getting several questions from around North America asking about the B-25 squadron in the Tuskegee Airmen. What could you tell us about that team?
Well, you can see really in the Red Tail movie is what I call about the first two phases of the Tuskegee experience. The first squadron, 99th Pursuit and later Fighter Squadron, then the 332nd Fighter Group, which was the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, and all four were together once they got the P-51. But following them was the 477th Bomb Group Medium, 4 squadrons there, and they were preparing to go to the Pacific, and all of their support in training for that venture. But when we dropped the big bomb, the training retrenched, and the 477th finally faded out. However, they played an important part in the Tuskegee experience because they fought racism here at home, if you will. Some folks may know there was at that time called a double V program that we were fighting. First V was fighting for victory against Hitler in Europe. Second V was fighting against racism here at home. And in fact, 101 of the officers of the 477 put their careers on the line to fight the racist action to prevent them from using facilities that they were by Army regulation authorized to use. And but that's quite a story. We'd have to have a different time. And of course, that wasn't included in the Red Tails movie. Red Tails are the fighter pilots that got into Europe, and the medium bomb folks didn't get into combat but played an important part in what the experience has meant for our country, because it allowed the Air Force, when it's separated from the Army components, to realize that talent doesn't come in color.
It's an amazing story, and for those of you who are interested in learning more about the B-25, the bomber squadrons in the Tuskegee Airmen, I strongly encourage everyone to make it part of your bucket list to get to Chanute Army Air Base in Chanute, Illinois. I am told that the B-25 they have in that fantastic collection is a Tuskegee Airmen pedigreed B-25, and it is a remarkable aircraft to see. I can see we're being joined by at least one of our B-25 pilots from the Commemorative Air Force. Welcome to that team, and I'm sure they'll echo my sentiments about getting to the incredible exhibits at the Chanute Museum. Well worth your time to find your way there, and I'm sure you'll be pleased that you did. Colonel McGee and Colonel Brown, would either of you be willing to tell some of the stories of some of the interesting people you've worked with? This is from Tim Barson in Minneapolis. Colonel McGee, how about some of the interesting characters you've had the pleasure of working with through the years?
You're really putting me on the spot, because remembering names and some details is something that hadn't been my forte at all. But along the way, certainly I could probably come up with some. And course, for the start and during the Tuskegee experience, to have worked under and gotten to know as close as you could get to know B.O. Davis Jr. was certainly a highlight of those days. He was a very interesting man, certainly a soldier, a true soldier, and was a good leader for, as I say, we young second and first lieutenants as we entered our careers, and but in that early day, certainly he stands out.
Wonderful. I apologize for that that viewer putting you on the spot. We'll reprimand him mightily about it in a little while. We have one viewer asking you to talk about Frank Borman. Can you discuss your experiences with the American astronaut Frank Borman?
Yes, I could very quickly tell you the story. After fighting in Korea, I went back to the Philippines for a career and became the commander of the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron. And for our listeners, too, that's something else. That I became a commander of the squadron that took place overseas. That type of action just didn't take place here in the country because of the attitude and the Army policy. But anyway, in that capacity, it happened that Frank was over in the Philippines as a second lieutenant, and of course he had graduated from the Army school, and then had come over into the Air Force, and they gave him different jobs. He worked for some tasks for 13th Air Force there at Clark Field in the Philippines, and then for some tasks that we had going on in the fighter group was assigned to the squadron. But my relationship with him is one that he had developed a problem that the flight surgeon that took him off of flying status, and the flight surgeon didn't want to put him back on flying status there in the Philippines. And I guess the easiest way to say it is we bootlegged some flying time in the F-80 for him, and they found out that I think it was some type of ear problem and so on, that he got along fine, and finally got the flight surgeon to agree to put him back on flying status. And of course, you know the rest of his story. But it was one of those things that you might say we fighter guys looking out for each other did, and fortunately worked out very successfully for him. And we've been friends, he and his wife, many, many years.
Well, that's an interesting story, Chuck, and that's the first time that I have heard that story.
Yep.
Well, we're here to try and divulge a lot of secrets that might not have been apparent from the film or for some of the untold histories that these remarkable gentlemen have lived. One of the really interesting questions I see here comes from Nikki Archambault, and the question is, what content was not included in the Red Tails film that you would have liked to see to help everyone appreciate what you experienced?
The question was what content?
That again?
Yeah, what was in the film? What was not in the film? What was left out of the Red Tails film that you would have liked to see in the film to help people appreciate what you went through?
Oh, boy.
I thought the film did a pretty good job. We had tent cities like they depicted. We had some mud like they depicted in and around to add to the film of how we took fuel cans and made stoves and rigged us up heat for our tents and something like that. But hey, you'd need a 3-hour movie and a whole lot more time to do some of those things, depict everything. But I thought they did a pretty good job in those combat scenes of showing, and what else they could show that would make a difference. I don't know. We had some times when either the bombers couldn't get the weather kept them from targets, but we could go do some fighter sweeps that we probably destroyed more, but that was depicted in the film. We did destroy more German aircraft on the ground than I think in the aerial victories. Do you see anything, Harold?
No, not really. And if you go back and looking at that movie, the whole movie is primarily an action movie. And, of course, the feature was all of the air battles and whatnot. And that was really the heart of it. And I thought that they didn't leave a heck of a lot to the imagination. Whoever that producer was who came up with some of those acrobatic scenes, there are things that I have never seen in flying an airplane. But that's what the movie is all about. And because then when you look at the roles that was played, the gentleman who was, I assume, was playing the role of B.O. Davis and Cuba walking around sucking on that pipe, those in comparison to the action part of the film were very, very minor. And those roles weren't really developed that much at all. So everything in that movie was primarily focused on what happened in the air during the missions and whatnot. And that, I thought, was very entertaining, and they really did a good job in that.
Fantastic. We've got a good question from Charles Goings wanting to know, Colonel Brown, if you had a nickname during the war years, and if so, what was it?
A nickname? Let me see. Did I have a nickname? Well, I had a couple of nicknames that I just couldn't repeat over the air, but let me see if I can think of one that would be appropriate. You know, other than the fact that, you know, it's interesting. There were two Harold H. Browns. One was Harold Haywood Brown, me, and the other one was Harold Howard Brown, who went into twin engines. And I always owned the Buick, and he always owned an Oldsmobile. So I was Buick Brown, and he was Oldsmobile Brown. And that was how we were pretty much known when we were stationed up in Columbus, Ohio, from 46 to 49. And that kind of followed us, you know. And right to this day, if the names come up, well, who are you talking about, Buick Brown or Oldsmobile Brown? But other than that, I really didn't have any that I can read.
That's perfectly fine, and I am very, very eager to read your memoirs, sir, so we can see if some of those other elements might see the light of day. We certainly hope so.
I will tell my wife she better not put any of those things in those memoirs.
We're going to try and issue her some bribes on the side to see if we can get all of the gory details about your wonderful experiences. We're getting a lot of questions from people about what were your favorite aircraft to fly. Colonel Brown, what were your reflections on the airplanes that you flew during the World War II years?
Well, during World War II, unquestionably, it was the P-51. Now, I only flew the P-40. I didn't fly the P-39, but I got all my fighter training in the P-47 because when we graduated, the 332nd Fighter Group was just getting P-47s, so they got us P-47. However, the 332nd only had those P-47s for no more than about 30-odd days, and then they had a change of equipment and went to the P-51. But I flew the P-47 in the fighter training for just about 2.5 months, about 60 hours or so, which was nice. But bottom line, you just cannot beat the P-51. That was the #1 aircraft. It had everything you would want in an airplane: speed, maneuverability. It had it all going for it. And in my opinion, that was probably the greatest World War II airplane using conventional propeller-driven that was ever made, was that P-51.
It is a remarkable airplane, and if people who are listening tonight are interested in getting to know what flying in the P-51 Mustang is like, we at the Red Tail Squadron are ready to share that experience with you. So dial into redtail.org and click on the button Ride the Mustang. That'll give you details about what it's like and give you some more information about how you can personally experience the ride in the P-51C Mustang that the Red Tail Squadron delivers around the country. Back to that question on favorite aircraft, Colonel McGee, can you share your comments with us?
Well, certainly I had the opportunity to fly the P-39, the P-47, and the P-51 in the combat theater. And P-39 was a low altitude, just too slow, wasn't used in escort mission at all, and that's the reason we started the escort work with the Thunderbolt. That was great. Those 8 guns, a big cockpit, roomy cockpit, but that big radial nose just limits it, and its supercharging limits your altitude. You could get individual aircraft, say, to 28 or 30,000 feet, but you couldn't fly a squadron formation and the type of escort work we were doing well with the 47. 51 gave us, as I say, good from the ground to 35,000 feet, close to a 1,000-mile range, and speed. It was just a wonderful little aircraft, as Harold has said, top fighter of the day and time, and it was just a joy to fly it, and you can tell from the number of Mustangs around the country, people still like the Mustang, and we always have to qualify that, though, with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine.
It's an amazing aircraft, and again, I want to invite everyone to take advantage of the opportunity to get into the P-51C Mustang through the Red Tail Squadron. What really excites me about being involved with the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron in all of these events is the excitement and the thrill of introducing the youngsters to these living legends and heroes. This question from a 4th grader named Samantha is directed to both of you gentlemen. She's doing a report on Luther Smith and wants to know if you flew with him and do you have any interesting stories to tell about him.
Well, yes, I flew with Luther. Unfortunately, we lost him just a few years back, and he was injured in an aircraft accident, as I recall, but Luther was one of the Red Tail pilots, and did know him.
I never did know Luther Smith that well. I knew of him and whatnot, but beyond that, I have very, very little knowledge about Luther.
I'm told that Luther shares the fine and proud Iowa heritage that Jim Gomer does as well. So two proud Iowa pilots for the Red Tail missions, the Tuskegee Airmen, and we're awfully proud to have gotten to know both of those gentlemen. And follow-on questions here from Ed Powell. Why the qualification of the Merlin Rolls engine, and can you tell us about the limitations of the Allison engine that preceded it? Colonel Brown, can you comment on that, please?
Oh, that's simple. The Allison engine was about as sorry an engine that's ever been built, and it didn't have near the reliability that the Merlin. And the smartest thing they did was when they joined with the Merlin and built the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine. With the long-range flying that we were doing in the P-51, the Allison engine, there's no way that any pilot would have that kind of confidence in that engine to fly that piece, that if that were the engine in the 51 and we were dependent upon that engine to take us 5, 6, 6.5, 7-hour missions. There's just no way. Allison just didn't have it. Well, it couldn't hold a candle to the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine.
Yeah, it was supercharging. It was a difficult engine to keep well tuned, particularly in damp, wet weather.
Very interesting story. Did you have with the ammunition carried on the Mustang?
It seems to me.
I don't know.
It seems to me I recollect that there was 100 rounds for each of the guns in the trays that were in the wings. But again, we were the pilots, and you'd have to talk to the armorers to.
We'll try and track down some of the armorers for the future webinars we're planning on doing or hoping to do, and see if we can get some of their insights. An interesting story that I was told on the air show circuit some years ago was that the length of the ammo belts that were loaded into the Mustang were approximately 27 feet, and as a result, when the pilots would come back from their combat sorties and asked how it went, and the reply was often, "We gave them the whole 9 yards," and apparently that's the origin of that thing.
Pretty good.
John Tenuto asks, could you tell us a little bit about what it was like adjusting to life at home after the war?
Well, to come back and still realize that you couldn't just pick and choose the restaurant or the hotel you were going to stay in, and certainly, well, in my experience, coming back, we were given a week at rest and recuperation, they called it, and I was one of selected to go to a hotel on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, New Jersey. First time that blacks slept in the bed and wasn't the maid making up the bed. So we opened some doors in those experiences, and some folks began to learn that shouldn't be a problem.
And Colonel Brown, how about you? What was the adjustment like coming home?
You know, it's interesting. I came home. I was 20 years old when I arrived home on the 22nd of June in 1945. Because we were POWs, we did get preference on transportation back to the States. And I had a 60-day leave after I got home. But there I was, a little snotty-nosed 20-year-old, wasn't old enough to vote, and nothing had changed. Minneapolis, Minnesota was the same way when I returned as when I left it. But Minneapolis, Minnesota wasn't in the Deep South, and you had an entirely different living experience living up in Minnesota. We were a very small population, less than 1/2 of 1% of the population, and there was just absolutely no change. And at that early age in my life, I just wasn't that astute about the whole menu about the politics and all the racial conflicts and so forth that was going on. Primarily because, having been born and raised in Minneapolis, I just didn't experience all of those things that was experienced by some guy born down in Mississippi. It was just two entirely, different experiences. And it wasn't until I got a little older that then I started realizing just how politicized this whole racial issue really was. And that is when I really become attuned to what was really going on. But in my early years when I got back, I was just happy to be home, a snotty-nosed kid, having very little or no life experiences other than what I had during the war. And that was it for me. So you're talking about being naive. I was about as naive as you can get, you know.
Very, very interesting stuff. And there are a couple of people asking similar questions. Jackie McKinney writes, I'm curious, were you able to get professional jobs once you returned to the U.S.? And I'm going to add to that by asking if it is true that none of the Tuskegee Airmen were able to get airline jobs once they came back from combat?
That's true. It
not initially.
It took a couple of lawsuits of a gentleman in the early '60s before the airlines finally realized they were fighting the wrong battle and that blacks could be good airline pilots as well as anybody else. And speaking of situations, I was assigned to Wold Chamberlain Field after coming from the Philippines and attending command and staff school, and I could not find a home to rent or buy in Minneapolis. Ended up living in St. Paul. And even though the newspaper, the largest newspaper in Minneapolis, had several pages of houses for sale and rent, but it wasn't for blacks at that time. So it took, you might say, we opened some doors or some eyes as to providing equal opportunity and equal access, but it took the civil rights action in the '60s before it made it a little easier to travel around the country and just be an American citizen and take advantage, as you may choose, of what was going on in the country.
Amazing stories. And I want to thank Bill Zook from Winnipeg, Canada, who's tuned in to this broadcast, for correcting my statement about the whole 9 yards. Apparently that was the ammunition load of the Hawker Hurricane and the Spitfire, and the quote came from the Battle of Britain. This clearly illustrates why it is so important for us to get all of our kids, all of our relatives, and all the historians to the air shows to meet the actual people who fought these battles, who lived this history, and who have changed the social fabric of the American culture and the entire military. And we're coming to the close of our first 45 minutes in this session, and I certainly hope we can impose on Colonel McGee and Colonel Brown to stay with us for a few additional minutes. Would that be all right, gentlemen?
A few more will be fine.
You laid it on me again. Absolutely.
Just how we roll here at the Red Tail Squadron. We do appreciate that. We want to ask everyone who's tuned in to also take a moment to jot down the website for redtail.org and learn more about our mission to help carry the story to every classroom in North America and beyond. Is our deepest hope is that we can carry this far and wide, because you get the real story from the real people, and this is what drives us to keep doing this. So let's see, let me get to a question here that I haven't already covered, if you'll bear with me. Let's see, there's one here. One moment, please. What kind of activities did you do for relaxation between your missions?
Well, we all had extra duty jobs. In other words, besides flying, whether you helped out in the personal equipment or somewhere in supply or somewhere in the maintenance operation. That took a little time, but there were occasions where we weren't that far from the ocean. Of course, in the winter months, that wasn't a chance to go do anything, but when the summer months and when it was nice to be able to get down to the ocean for a little swim and that type of thing. And as I say, we ended up, although segregated overseas, we never got to the Isle of Capri for rest camp, but we had a villa in Naples, and we'd go there for a few days of just relaxation, not having to get up at that early hour, attend a briefing and so on, just do a little reading and provide little library books and that type of thing. So those were the ways of relaxing.
Well, I did very, very little, to be quite honest with you. Other than rest and recuperation R&R over in Naples, Italy, which only happened a few times for me anyway, but in between, missions, bad weather and whatnot, we would stand down for maybe 2 or 3 days at a time, and weather wouldn't allow us to fly any missions. For the most part, we just kind of hung around. We didn't do much of anything. We were there on the base. And it isn't that we were that isolated, but there was nothing but a few very small towns around Ramitelli, and there just wasn't a heck of a lot to do, to be quite honest about it. And I spent, the vast majority of my time just hanging around on base, really. So other than R&R, which only happened, after you flew X amount of missions, I didn't do much of anything, to be quite honest with you. Just kind of roam around within the general vicinity of the base, and that was it.
We have a question about, curiosity about the annual get-togethers. Dennis Fight wants to know, do the Red Tails have regular annual meetings or more frequently around the country that you might be able to share some information about?
Well, probably the best answer for that is that no, the Red Tails don't. Do the Tuskegee Airmen have one? Yes. Remember, the Red Tails is just half of the organization. Leaves out, if you just say the Red Tails, you're leaving out the B-25 pilots and all of their support. We organized the national organization in 1972 at a meeting in Detroit, followed by a meeting here in Washington in 73, in which we confirmed the organization. And that's when we said, what do we call ourselves? And that's where the term calling ourselves Tuskegee Airmen came about. In the early days, we didn't call ourselves Tuskegee Airmen. It happened to be where we got all our training. But it is, what would we call ourselves when we formed a national organization? That came out. We had gatherings, Chicago, Detroit, here Washington, L.A., the big city concentrations. So we started with those 3 or 4 chapter areas, organized ourselves into 3 regions, and have some 50 chapters around the country today, with a very strong national scholarship fund and scholarship assistance provided by a number of the chapters in their youth and aviation programs.
Anything to add to that, Colonel Brown?
No, that is pretty much it. Just like Colonel McGee said, they divided up into 3 sections around the country, and one of the chapters in one of those areas would be responsible for a annual meeting of the whole Tuskegee Airmen. We do that once a year. We do it every year sometime in August or so. we have a national meeting, and it rotates. The West Coast and the center of the country, then out to the East Coast. And one of the chapters are responsible for it, but it is at the national, which has the organization and the money and the know-how to really pull off a meeting of that size, because we're talking about 700-800 people showing up. So you have to have some kind of an organization to really pull that off, and that's all done at the national level. Even though it may be sponsored by one of the chapters in the region in which you are holding the national meeting for that year. But other than that, it's a good organization. We've made it available to people who were not original Tuskegee Airmen to become Tuskegee Airmen, and that's the only way that we can keep this organization alive. It's interesting. A good friend of mine, Leo Gray, came up with some numbers, and the numbers that he came up with recently, that there's only about 10-12% of all of those red-tailed pilots who are still amongst us. And we are a dying breed. And within another few years, I hate to say it, but there aren't going to be any original people left. And whoever came up with the idea to bring in younger people into the organization to sustain it and keep it moving forward was perhaps a pretty good idea. And if that had not come up, it would have been last man out, turn off the light and close the door, and that would have been the end of it, which I think would have been a tragedy if this organization had died that way. But this way, the organization is ongoing. It will continue. It will continue long after Colonel McGee and I have departed you folks, because let's face it, we're in the twilight years of our lives, and we don't have too many years left. And this is when I get up every morning, I say, well, I got another day, so I'll hang around a little longer. But the organization will continue. It will thrive. And I just hope that the people who are coming in, the young folks, will remember the original people who made all this possible and will get out and promote it the way it should be promoted.
Indeed, that is very, very important, and I know you share our enthusiasm for the educational mission, and rest assured the Red Tail Squadron will be telling your story for many, many years to come. In fact, the
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
And I know you share my enthusiasm, gentlemen, for the young people who have sent in questions tonight and the others that have participated in the earlier broadcasts. I have another one, and it's thrilling to me, from the youngsters through the college years and even the elder historians that we interact with come up with some of the greatest questions. Here's one from John Tenuto, who's a sociology professor, organizing a panel for their students about the Tuskegee Airmen next week. His question is this: what would you like a college student today to know about your days in the military and during the war? And he echoes the sentiments of almost every other questioner in thanking you for your service, and I'll wait for your answer. Colonel McGee?
Well, certainly, probably one of the best ways.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
And say in 4 Ds or 4 Ps. 4 Ps. Perceive, dream your dreams. Prepare, get the education. Education is the key to what we accomplish. So perceive, prepare, perform, seek excellence, don't settle for being mediocre, and persevere. Don't let obstacles be an excuse for not accomplishing what you're capable of and what our country needs to preserve the freedoms we so much enjoy.
Very, very well put. Thank you. And Colonel Brown, anything you could add to that for the college students and the younger students who are studying this?
Well, it would be a little difficult for me to say it any more clear than Chuck has said it. But it is all about the young people. And if we do nothing more during our lifetime, I certainly hope that they will learn the lesson that we learned, in that we overcame numerous obstacles, we refused to accept second best, we did our very, very best, we put our best foot forward, we achieved, we overcame adversity, obstacles, you name it. And I cannot think of anything better, even that's going on by the Red Tail Project and promoting that level of thinking. Because right now we are expending all of our energy, the few of us who are left, to just encourage, motivate, get these kids to stay in school, encourage them to dream the impossible dream. Don't allow anyone to tell you that you can't do anything. You can go as far as your God-given talents will allow you to go. And if we can just get that message across and keep these kids in school, then that's about all that we could possibly hope for.
I can't imagine how anyone could say it any better than that. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will join me, and if we had the ability to give a round of applause and a standing ovation for these gentlemen, I'm certain we would all be sharing that right now. I would encourage you, as we wrap this up for the evening, to invite your friends, your family, all of the schools in your area to participate in our upcoming webinar on Sunday afternoon. We'll be doing the final webinar on Sunday afternoon with these gentlemen. The registration procedure is the same, and we look forward to more outstanding comments from these eloquent ambassadors for justice and truth. One of the topics I want to make sure we touch on in Sunday's webinar is the 1949 Top Gun competition. Some interesting stories about that, and we look forward to getting your comments on that episode of the history, gentlemen. And as we draw this to a close, I invite any closing comments. Colonel McGee?
Well, thanks to those that have come online and for the questions, and appreciate their interest. And as I say, remember, it's all about our motivating the young folks. Thanks a lot.
Colonel Brown, anything else from you for the evening?
No, 3 great webinars, great questions, a wonderful opportunity for us to respond to them. And I certainly thank you, Stan, for the fine job that you have done in holding this whole thing together. And I'm looking forward to Sunday at 3 p.m. And perhaps you will need to extend it for another 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or God knows how many of them.
I'm targeting 199 of these if we can possibly pull them together. I'm very, very honored to have the opportunity to visit with you and especially to share the living history that you gentlemen present to the audience. On behalf of, go ahead.
Good luck.
Well, we're very optimistic about it because this really does go a long way towards helping us achieve our objective of carrying the lessons and legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen into every classroom in America and, in fact, throughout North America and eventually the entire planet and beyond. It is a worthwhile story, an inspiring story, and we believe it has relevance for many, many years to come. On behalf of the Commemorative Air Force and the Red Tail Squadron, thank you sincerely for joining us, and please tune in again on Sunday, February 12th, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 o'clock Central. You can do the math for the rest of the continent, and we look forward to seeing you then. For the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron, I'm your moderator, Stan Ross. Thanks for joining us.